Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other topics, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Are your ulcerative colitis symptoms proving difficult to manage? Tremfya guselkumab can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. At 1 year, many patients taking Tremfya achieved clinical remission, and some patients also achieved endoscopic remission. Individual results may vary. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Ask your doctor if Tremfya can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more, or visit tremfyaradio.com.
Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times Union podcast driven by CDTA. March is in like a lion here at the Times Union. We got lots to talk about. Welcome to another episode of The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. I'm Jessica Marshall. Let's jump right in. All right, we're back again with Times Union Editor-in-Chief Casey Seiler. We're going to go over some of the week's top stories. We'll start at the tippy top with the Trump administration slashing the federal workforce by hundreds of thousands, I guess. And this week, news that the Department of Education's laying off half of its staff. Job cuts are happening all over the country, and the capital region has not been spared. Can you kind of tell us what's happening? What are we seeing here?
Yeah, tippy is definitely the right word to apply here, because there is a sense of precariousness for so many workers whose paycheck is dependent either directly or indirectly on federal funding. Whether you're a federal worker or your job is supported by federal grants, the ripples are definitely beginning to hit upstate New York. Kathleen Moore sat in on a roundtable that was hosted by Representative Paul Tonko, of course, a Democrat, with several of the workers who have been impacted. And they cover everything from, folks who worked on housing assistance to people who were working on federally funded projects to map areas of flooding that could be impacted by, everything from climate change to your classic spring storm. Lots of folks at the National Weather Service and affiliated organizations are heading for the door, as it were. So the impacts are being felt both in the bureaucracy and professions such as civilian workers at the Watervliet Arsenal, which, as many of our listeners know, is 2 centuries old, made cannons going all the way back to the War of 1812, still in operation as an affiliated property controlled by the U.S. Army. But what we have heard this week is that labor leaders are expecting that about 40% of the staff at the Arsenal could find their jobs ending there as the result of cuts. That, they say, would result in a serious reduction of the production capacity of the Arsenal, which, as noted, has been producing big guns for this country and other countries who are allied with us for a very, very long time.
Of course, we will be watching that very closely as things develop. Let's go on to some state news. More than 2,000 state corrections officers are being terminated this week. They refused to return to work after a strike last month. So tell us more about what's going on there.
Yeah, this is the wildcat strike at prisons across New York that Brendan Lyons, our Capitol Bureau Chief and Investigations Managing Editor, has been covering so well. Uh, and in the final days of this strike, there have been a lot of very long days and weekends for Brendan because this is the labor action that seemingly would not end. We have had deals reached, settlement agreements that have been struck with representatives of the Wildcat Strikers, representatives of the State Correction Officers Union, which did not endorse this strike, but has still nonetheless been at the table negotiating potential ways to end it. And of course, Governor Kathy Hochul's administration and the State Corrections Agency. In the past weekend, we went on Thursday from NSCOBA, which is the Correction Officers Union, saying, hey, we can't support this deal because we weren't at the table. Then there appeared to be an agreement on Friday night that would end the strike. That blew up Saturday morning. And then Saturday night, right around dinner time, it appeared that a three-way deal had been struck that would require all workers to come back on the job on Monday. And then on Monday, there were several workers, hundreds of workers, as you noted, who decided not to return, who were dissatisfied with elements of the deal, whether it was the desire to see retroactive reinstatement of healthcare benefits, or kind of taking it more statewide, changes they want to see, many of the workers and the union for that matter, want to see to what is known as the HALT Act, which is legislation passed a couple of years ago that restricted the use of solitary confinement, which state workers say is making prisons more dangerous for them. And of course, advocates for the incarcerated say was a righteous tool to stop the use of what's a potentially very dangerous and harmful form of discipline behind bars. So, yes, the Hochul administration is now saying those who did not come back on the job as of Monday will not only lose their jobs and, of course, lose their benefits, but also they will not be able to work at any state agency going forward. And that's a very big deal. We, of course, expect that that is going to be fought out as a civil matter in the courts. But there you go.
There is a lot going on there, so I urge all of our listeners to go over to timesunion.com to our New York section and read everything that Brendan and the rest of the crew have written about it, because, yeah, it's a lot. Let's pivot to entertainment news, where we heard that Steven Spielberg is coming back to the Hudson Valley to film a new movie. Casey, what do you think about that?
Well, as a longtime Steven Spielberg fan and a former entertainment editor at this fine publication, I am, of course, very excited. Of course, Steven Spielberg has never made a movie before about UFOs and aliens, so this is going to be something very new for him, Jess.
Totally out of his wheelhouse.
Yes, exactly. As I was mentioning to somebody yesterday, actually to Katie Kiesling, who reported out this story, Spielberg has made lovable aliens with E.T., terrifying aliens with War of the Worlds, the last time he filmed a movie in the Hudson Valley, and of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where they're kind of threatening but ultimately very friendly. So, where this will come down on the Steven Spielberg Aliens from Outer Space spectrum still remains to be seen. What we know about this movie, which is, of course, very much under wraps, is that it will star Emily Blunt, Coleman Domingo, a recent Best Actor nominee for Sing Sing, also set upstate, Jess.
I'm sensing a theme.
Josh O'Connor and Colin Firth, supposed to be in theaters in July of 2026, and they are going to be filming in April. So if you go to timesunion.com, you can check out the information, including the rate, which is $216 for 8 hours if you're in the SAG-AFTRA union, or a mere $181.50 for 10 hours if you're not.
Absolutely. And you also get to probably see Steven Spielberg in action. So that's pretty exciting. Yeah, head over to timesunion.com for all those details. Casey, thank you so much for joining us. We will check back in with you in a future episode.
Jess, you're welcome. And remember, we are not alone.
For more on all of the stories that we just discussed, visit timesunion.com or subscribe to any of our social media channels. You think you're saving the planet? When we come back, we'll talk about the things that do not belong in your recycling bin.
Why is healthcare so expensive? What's happening with climate change? And are elections safe? You can find answers to those questions and a lot more with Capital Confidential from me, Dan Clark. I give you the latest news and analysis from the state capitol and beyond. Sign up now at capitalconfidential.com. That's capital with an O, confidential.com.
"12-year-old Jaliek Rainwalker vanished without a trace from a small upstate New York village on a cool November night in 2007. His adoptive parents say he ran away. Police believe he was murdered, but a body has never been found, and a suspect has never been named.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah,
Appreciate
okay,
that.
all right, but you don't want to talk.
Then when I learned they were trying to undo the adoption, that's when I learned that this story was very complicated, well, a lot more complicated than I even thought.
Almost 2 decades later, the case remains unsolved. I'm Jessica Marshall.
And I'm Wendy Libertar.
In this podcast from the Times-Union, we take a deep dive into the mystery of this missing child and try to find some answers.
So have you come to terms that Jaliek is probably dead?
Yes. I feel that he was killed on November 1st, 2007.
Available now, wherever you listen to podcasts.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times-Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times-Union subscriber today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Eagle, a Times-Union podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Marshall. Do you recycle? I try to. Where I live, we have single-stream recycling. Everything that's recyclable goes into one bin that I put out on the curb once a week for pickup. The truck comes by, grabs that blue bin with its robotic arm, and swallows up my discarded plastic, glass, and cardboard. I feel a little lighter every week after that happens, like I've done my small part to save the planet. But did I really? Turns out some of the stuff that I am throwing in that blue bin, and what many others around the region are similarly doing, might not be recyclable after all. Joining us now on The Eagle is Times-Union reporter Lucy Hodgman. Lucy recently wrote an article on timesunion.com called 15 Things That Don't Belong in Your Recycle Bin. I like to think that I recycle, right? Like, I think that I like to be doing my part for Mother Earth. But after I read your article, I'm like, well, maybe I'm not so sure. So let's kind of start with the premise of the article, right? There are a lot of people who are doing recycling wrong. So where did you start with this?
Yeah, well, what I found out pretty quickly is that things like glass and cardboard and paper can usually be recycled. They have pretty similar chemical compounds across different forms of glass or different forms of paper. But things like plastic are all actually pretty different. So the chemicals used to make a detergent bottle are very different when you get down to the makeup of them than those used to make like a floppy piece of plastic that connects a 6-pack of beer, for example.
When you looked at kind of the spectrum, you're looking at kind of the capital region. Do you have like geographical area that you were looking at for this?
Yeah, I was mostly focusing on the city of Albany's municipal recycling program, which the things that I'm talking about in this article are sort of specific to there. But while other places and private recycling facilities or other municipalities might have slightly different rules, most of these things can't be recycled across all of those. But my focus is in Albany just because obviously it's local and I had access to it here.
Sure. All right. So can you define what exactly is single stream recycling?
I can. So single stream recycling is what we have here in the city of Albany and what a lot of local municipalities have, because I assume it's just easier to get people to put anything in their recycling in that case. So
right, you just toss it in the bin, put it out on the curb, and you can feel good about yourself.
Right, and it's paper and plastic and metal, just anything in the same sort of jumble together.
There's a list like on the, City of Albany's website, right? They have a list of the things that you can put in there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what that means is someone eventually has to separate those out because they can't all be recycled together. So for the story, I got to visit one of the plants where that happens, which is pretty close to downtown Albany, actually. It's nearby. And they have conveyor belts where all of that sort of gets sorted out using optical sorters, which are technology that uses cameras to separate paper from plastic, from metal, from glass. And then humans also do the work of combing out things that can especially be recycled. So from there, a lot of those actually recyclable goods, things like cardboard and paper and glass and certain kinds of plastic, can all go to their second location. They get sold to manufacturers, or they go to a specialty recycling plant that specializes in just glass or just forms of plastic. But a lot of what ends up there also gets funneled through to the landfill, either because it can't be recycled or is somehow contaminated.
Were you able to kind of find numbers, like what percentage of the stuff that gets picked up on recycling day actually goes to a second location for recycling, essentially?
Like what reaches the second location, 85% of that goes to another place from there or goes somewhere down the pipe. But that also includes all the non-plastic things that get recycled. So of the plastic, when people I talked to estimated was that maybe 5 or 6% of the plastic that you put in your recycling bin actually, gets recycled and turned into a new product, which is obviously a pretty low percentage.
Yeah, it's a little depressing. So I guess let's get into the meat of it. Like what are the things that don't belong? What are we throwing in our recycling bin that should not be thrown in the recycling bin?
Maybe it's easier to say what you can recycle because it's so narrow, which is hard plastic items pretty much. So sort of non-flexible things like a detergent bottle or like a yogurt cup, maybe. Things that are sturdy, but for example, like a soda bottle you can recycle, you can't recycle the cap. That's made of a different kind of plastic. And you also can't recycle the label. So there are kinds of little sort of caveats within that. And then anything that is sort of flimsy, like a plastic bag or a 6-pack holder, like I mentioned, or trying to think of other good examples, a candy bar wrapper, those things can maybe be recycled in some facility. There are some places that will have specific like plastic bag drop-offs at grocery stores, but they can't go in that single stream recycling just because most local recycling facilities don't have the capacity to break them down.
So if I threw a soda bottle, like a plastic soda bottle, in my recycling bin with the cap on, does that mean the whole thing gets trashed?
It's a good question. I think it might vary depending on where it's being taken from there. Ideally, it can be separated out, but I think a lot of the time things sort of end up in the same stream and do end up heading to a landfill.
Oh, so is it more effective than to just kind of sort things yourself and like take them to the grocery store, to the bottle deposit? Like, what's the best way to recycle?
I think sorting things out yourself is probably the most effective way of making sure things go into the recycling. And you definitely can continue recycling those hard plastic things as they're still ending up in recycling. And you shouldn't stop recycling altogether, especially when it comes to things like paper and glass and cardboard that can pretty easily be recycled. But a lot of what the sort of environmental advocates that I talked to said is that our focus should mostly be on cutting down plastic use and reusing it whenever possible. Like if you can use your sort of like plastic, maybe yogurt container one more time to store leftovers, like that is having a much more of an impact on the environment than if that is going straight into recycling.
All right. So you got a whole list of things here. So everything from like toys to plexiglass, clothes hangers, some stuff that I don't personally throw in the recycling, but people do, like styrofoam, that's everywhere. What was, I guess, the most surprising thing that you found that people were throwing in their recycling bins that shouldn't, right? You talked a lot about the plastic bottles, which I think are pretty common, but like, what's the most surprising thing that you learned?
Yeah, well, asking people who work at recycling facilities or in recycling generally, like what is the craziest thing people recycle was one of the more sort of fun parts of the story. People said entire lamps have gone to recycling, batteries more often than you think, which I guess I understand, like they sort of seem like they should be recyclable, plastic toys, little like styrofoam trays that come in like a package of chicken maybe end up in the recycling a lot of the time, packing peanuts, things like that. Yeah, I mean, people are trying to do the right thing for sure, but it all gets pretty contaminated once it's all bound up together.
So batteries, that's a question that I always have. Like, how do you properly recycle batteries?
What Albany says is that they should be treated as hazardous waste. And so the city will have sort of hazardous waste drop-off events where you can bring your batteries to them and they'll deal with them. But obviously a lot of people are not thinking about it in that kind of long term and are maybe more inclined to just throw their batteries away or try and recycle them. And then they just sort of end up in the landfill a lot of the time.
And what's the danger of like just throwing your batteries out and having them end up in a landfill?
As far as I understand it, the batteries can leak and contaminate the rest of the either recyclables or the solid waste in the landfill, and they're hard to process. So the ideal, obviously, is to get them processed officially through the city.
Yeah. Did you have any kind of sense from the folks that you talked to about kind of what the future holds for recycling? Like, are there new technologies? Are there new ideas or strategies that people are talking about to kind of make recycling more efficient?
Well, it's interesting. There are sort of two schools of thought here, and they overlap a lot, but one of them is that we should just be using less plastic, period.
That's not a new idea.
Yeah. There's a bill in the legislature that I followed, which has been gaining a little bit of traction in the last couple of years that would require companies above a certain income threshold that have plastic packaging on their products to cut down that plastic and also to make investments in recycling infrastructure in local municipalities. But the main focus on that is that it would bring down the amount of plastic that's used in those products, with the argument that a lot of it is for marketing or aesthetic, and it's not really strictly necessary. But then there are others who are sort of wary about that idea and about maybe the burden that would put on companies, or they're especially loyal to things like individually wrapped slices of cheese or things that we've gotten used to, and would put the argument more on what's called advanced recycling or chemical recycling, which is a process that is used a little bit more in Europe, is the sense I've gotten, wherein extreme like heat and chemicals are used to break down plastic into its most basic components, and often that's used for fuel. But environmentalists don't tend to really like that possibility just because it uses so much energy that there's the suggestion that it sort of does more harm than good.
Right. It offsets the benefits of actually recycling.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else about what you wrote, what you discovered that you think is really important for the everyday recycler to know?
Yeah, it's interesting. So bills like the one in the legislature right now are more intended to put the burden on larger companies to cut down their plastic use, and they'll say that that's more important than individual responsibility. And I think that's an interesting argument, but a lot of the people who work on the ground level of recycling I've talked to have said that it is something we should to some degree view as a personal undertaking. So thinking about little ways to use less plastic, either that, whether that's, bringing metal silverware to work or using a reusable water bottle, or just thinking of it as sort of a lifestyle shift a little bit, while larger companies are also sort of being pushed in the same direction.
All right. Well, I am more conscious now of what I'm going to throw in my bin. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Head over to timesunion.com to read more about what should go in that recycling bin. That's it for this week. We will be back next week with another look inside our newsroom. The Eagle is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall, with help from Erica Smith and the Times-Union digital team. Special thanks this week to Casey Seiler and Lucy Hodgman for their contributions to this episode. Our music is Flyin' by Top Floor. Got questions or comments about this or any of our podcasts here at the Times-Union? Email us at podcast@timesunion.com. Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times-Union podcast driven by CDTA.